April 5th, 1242. The Baltic frontier, where the frozen expanse of Lake Peipus stretches toward distant horizons, two armies prepare to settle a conflict that will determine the religious and political future of Eastern Europe. 15,000 men stand ready to fight on ice thick enough to bear their weight, but treacherous enough to doom the defeated. This is not a tale of knights and glory. This is the story of how winter warfare, tactical discipline, and the unforgiving reality of fighting on frozen ground turned a medieval confrontation into one of history's most decisive battles. The armies facing each other across the white expanse represent fundamentally different approaches to conquest and survival. On one side, the military machine of the Livonian Order, backed by the religious authority of Rome and equipped with the finest armor and weapons that medieval Europe could produce. On the other, the forces of Novgorod under Prince Alexander Nevsky, defending not just territory, but the very existence of Orthodox Russia against Western expansion. What happens in the next few hours will echo through centuries of European history. But to understand why these men are prepared to die on the frozen surface of a Baltic lake, we need to step back to the broader conflict that brought them here. The year 1242 sits at the center of what historians call the Northern Crusades, a systematic campaign to extend Catholic Christianity and Western political control across the Baltic region. Unlike the famous Crusades to the Holy Land, this was a war fought in Europe's backyard, where religious conversion came at sword point and political submission followed military defeat. The Livonian Order represented the cutting edge of this expansion. Formed from the remnants of the Livonian Brothers of the Sword, after their catastrophic defeat at Saul in 1236, these warrior monks had reorganized under the broader umbrella of the Teutonic Order. They brought with them decades of experience in Baltic warfare, sophisticated military organization, and the unshakable conviction that they were doing God's work. Their success had been remarkable. Territory after territory had fallen to their methodical advance. Fortresses rose wherever they conquered. Local populations converted or died. The political map of the Eastern Baltic had been redrawn by German swords and Christian faith. Their military capabilities matched their ambitions. The Livonian knights were professional soldiers in an age when most armies consisted of seasonal levies and reluctant peasants. They wore the finest armor available, rode destriers specifically bred for warfare, and trained constantly in the devastating shock tactics that had made heavy cavalry the dominant force on medieval battlefields. Supporting them were crossbowmen whose mechanical weapons could punch through most armor at effective range, engineers capable of reducing stone fortifications, and auxiliary troops drawn from conquered territories. This was not a raiding party or a feudal levy. This was a military organization designed for conquest and occupation. The Knights' tactical doctrine emphasized the concentrated charge of heavy cavalry, a formation they called the cuneus or wedge. Picture it. Dozens of armored horsemen arranged in a triangular formation, lances leveled, charging at full gallop toward enemy lines. The psychological impact was often decisive before physical contact occurred. Infantry formations that held firm against conventional attacks would break and run when faced with the thundering approach of armored knights. Those who stood their ground died. The wedge punched through defensive lines like a spear through cloth, creating gaps that supporting forces could exploit. It was a proven system that had worked across Europe and the Baltic for generations. But the Livonian Order faced a problem that no amount of military skill could easily solve: distance and logistics. Their headquarters at Riga sat hundreds of kilometers from their eastern frontier. Every campaign required extensive planning, massive supply trains, and careful coordination between widely scattered garrisons. The territories they sought to conquer were vast, sparsely populated, and often hostile even after apparent submission. Success required not just military victory, but permanent occupation, which demanded resources that stretched even their considerable capabilities. More critically, they were approaching the limits of the world they understood. The Germanic and Baltic peoples they had conquered shared similar social structures, military traditions, and settlement patterns. The Russian principalities beyond Lake Peipus, represented something different. These were Orthodox Christian lands with their own military traditions, political systems, and cultural identity. The Russians were not pagans to be converted, but schismatics to be corrected, which created theological and legal complications that the straightforward conquest of pagan territory avoided. They possessed sophisticated military capabilities, extensive trade networks, and political alliances that extended far beyond the Baltic region. Against this expansion stood Alexander Nevsky, a 21-year-old prince who had already demonstrated remarkable military capabilities despite his youth. His victory over Swedish forces at the Neva River in 1240 had earned him his famous epithet and established his reputation as a commander capable of defeating Western armies. More importantly, Alexander understood the strategic situation facing Novgorod with unusual clarity. The Republic faced threats from multiple directions: Western crusaders seeking religious and territorial expansion, Eastern Mongol overlords demanding submission and tribute, and internal political divisions that could cripple effective resistance. Alexander's approach to this multi-front crisis demonstrated sophisticated strategic thinking. Rather than attempting to fight every enemy simultaneously, he chose to accommodate the Mongols while resisting Western expansion. This was not cowardice, but calculation. The Mongols demanded tribute and formal submission, but generally allowed local rulers to maintain power and permitted religious freedom. The Western Crusaders demanded territorial conquest, religious conversion, and complete political subordination. For Orthodox Russia, the Mongol yoke was burdensome but survivable. Western conquest meant cultural extinction. The army Alexander commanded reflected both the strengths and limitations of Novgorodian military organization. At its core stood the prince's personal retainers, the druzhina, perhaps 1,000 professional warriors equipped with the best armor and weapons available. These men formed the backbone of any major military operation, providing both tactical leadership and reliable heavy infantry. Around them gathered the militia of Novgorod itself, citizen soldiers who combined commercial prosperity with military obligation. These men knew why they fought and possessed the discipline that comes from defending one's own home. The largest contingent consisted of troops drawn from Novgorod's extensive territories and allied tribes. Finnish auxiliaries brought knowledge of winter warfare and skills with ranged weapons. Peasant levies provided numbers and local knowledge. Horse archers contributed mobility and harassment capabilities. This diverse force lacked the uniform equipment and training of the Livonian knights, but it possessed advantages that Alexander intended to exploit: familiarity with local conditions, flexibility in tactics, and the motivation that comes from fighting for survival rather than conquest. The immediate crisis that led to the confrontation at Lake Peipus began in 1240, when Livonian forces exploited Novgorod's apparent weakness following the Mongol invasions and Swedish attacks. They seized the fortresses of Izborsk and Pskov, key strongholds that controlled access to Novgorod's southern territories. This was more than opportunistic raiding. The capture of these positions represented a systematic attempt to establish permanent control over the approaches to Novgorod itself. If the Livonians could hold Pskov and Izborsk, they would control the trade routes that sustained Novgorod's commercial prosperity and could launch further attacks whenever circumstances favored expansion. Alexander's response demonstrated both patience and strategic insight. Rather than rushing to immediate confrontation, he spent months carefully preparing his counteroffensive. He negotiated with potential allies, gathered intelligence on Livonian dispositions, and assembled the largest army Novgorod could field. When he finally moved against the occupied territories in early 1242, his campaign was methodical and thorough. Koporia fell first, its garrison eliminated, and the fortress destroyed to prevent reoccupation. The liberation of Pskov followed, with the two Teutonic knights left to hold the citadel driven out and their local collaborators executed as examples. But Alexander understood that simply retaking lost territory would not solve the underlying problem. The Livonian Order remained powerful and would certainly attempt to regain what they had lost. The only way to secure a lasting peace was to inflict such a decisive defeat that further eastward expansion would become impossible. This required forcing the Livonians into battle under conditions that favored Novgorodian tactics while minimizing the advantages of Western heavy cavalry. The choice of Lake Peipus as the battlefield represented tactical brilliance of the highest order. The lake, fourth largest in Europe, provided a vast open space where large armies could maneuver without the restrictions imposed by forests, marshes, or fortifications. More crucially, the frozen surface created conditions that would neutralize many of the advantages that made Livonian knights so formidable. Heavy cavalry depends on firm footing, clear sight lines, and the ability to maintain formation during the charge. Ice-covered terrain complicated all of these requirements, while favoring infantry and lighter cavalry capable of adapting to difficult conditions. The decision to fight on the lake also reflected Alexander's understanding of enemy psychology. The Livonian knights were supremely confident in their military superiority. They had defeated every opponent they faced in the Baltic region. The idea that Russian forces would voluntarily offer battle on open ground seemed to promise an easy victory. Alexander counted on this overconfidence to draw the enemy into a position where their tactical advantages would become liabilities, and their numerical superiority would matter less than discipline and adaptability. As April arrived and the ice remained solid enough to support military operations, both armies moved toward the confrontation that would determine the fate of the eastern Baltic frontier. The morning of April 5, 1242, revealed conditions that would define everything about the coming battle. The ice on Lake Peipus had reached its maximum thickness after months of Baltic winter, creating a surface capable of supporting the weight of armored cavalry, but treacherous in ways that would become apparent only during combat. The temperature hovered just below freezing, cold enough to maintain the frozen surface, but warm enough to create patches of slush and areas where the ice became slippery under pressure. These conditions would prove decisive in ways that neither commander fully anticipated. Alexander Nevsky positioned his forces with careful attention to the terrain's subtle variations. The eastern shore of the lake, where he anchored his formation, provided stable ground for retreat if necessary, while offering elevated positions for observation. His deployment broke from traditional Russian military doctrine in significant ways. Rather than concentrating strength in the center, Alexander placed his most reliable troops on the flanks. The Druzina, his professional warriors, held the wings while militia and auxiliary forces formed the center. This arrangement was designed to absorb the expected Livonian charge while setting up the tactical envelopment that Alexander planned to execute once the enemy committed to their attack. The advance guard consisted of light cavalry, archers, and slingers positioned to harass the approaching enemy and disrupt their formation before the main engagement began. Behind the visible Russian line, concealed by the terrain and morning mist, Alexander positioned his reserve cavalry under his personal command. This force would remain hidden until the decisive moment, when the Livonian knights had fully committed to their charge and could no longer adapt to changing tactical conditions. Across the frozen expanse, the Livonian forces formed their characteristic wedge formation, the cuneus that had proven devastatingly effective throughout their Baltic campaigns. The sight was imposing. Several hundred heavily armored knights arranged in a triangular formation, their lances creating a forest of steel points directed toward the Russian lines. Supporting infantry and crossbowmen took positions behind and to the sides of the cavalry wedge, ready to exploit whatever breakthrough the knights achieved. The Livonian commanders faced a tactical dilemma they had not fully considered. Their standard doctrine called for a concentrated charge designed to punch through enemy lines and create chaos that supporting forces could exploit. But the frozen surface of Lake Peipus presented challenges that solid ground did not. Horses struggled to maintain footing on ice, especially when carrying the weight of armored riders. The formation that looked so formidable in static position would face severe stress once it began moving across the treacherous surface. At approximately 10 in the morning, the Livonian force began their advance. The wedge formation moved forward at a measured pace, commanders attempting to maintain cohesion while navigating the uneven ice. As the distance closed, the pace increased to a trot, then to a canter. The psychological effect was still considerable. The thunder of hooves on ice, the sight of hundreds of lance points approaching, the disciplined advance of what appeared to be an unstoppable force created the intimidation factor that had broken so many previous enemies. But the Russian center did not break. The militia and auxiliary troops, supported by the visible presence of professional warriors on the flanks, held their positions as the Livonian wedge crashed into their lines. The impact was severe. Men died as lances found gaps in armor or simply overwhelmed lighter equipment through sheer force. The Russian center bent under the pressure, giving ground as planned, but the line did not collapse entirely. Here the tactical complexities of fighting on ice became apparent. The Livonian knights, having penetrated the Russian center, found themselves unable to exploit their success effectively. The horses that had carried them through the initial charge were now struggling to maintain footing on ice that had become increasingly treacherous under the weight and movement of combat. Knights who fell found it difficult to regain their feet while wearing heavy armor on the slippery surface. The tight formation that had been their strength became a liability as wounded horses and fallen riders created obstacles for those still mounted. Alexander's flanking forces began their coordinated attack. The druzhina on both wings moved inward, attempting to envelop the Livonian formation that had become stretched and disorganized by their penetration of the center. Russian horse archers, more lightly equipped and therefore more mobile on the difficult terrain, began systematic attacks on the flanks and rear of the enemy formation. Their composite bows could not penetrate the heaviest armor at long range, but they could wound horses, target gaps in armor, and create additional confusion within the Livonian ranks. The battle evolved into exactly the type of grinding, close-quarters combat that favored the more numerous and more adaptable Russian forces. Individual duels between knights and druzhina warriors occurred throughout the melee, but the decisive factor was the gradual collapse of Livonian unit cohesion. Knights who had trained to fight as part of a disciplined formation found themselves isolated, surrounded, and unable to coordinate with their companions. The crossbowmen who formed a crucial part of the Livonian army found their weapons increasingly ineffective as the battle devolved into close combat. The mechanical advantage of their weapons meant nothing when friend and foe were intermixed across the battlefield. Many abandoned their crossbows for hand weapons and joined the melee, but they lacked the armor and training necessary to survive sustained combat against professional warriors. By midday, the Livonian formation had lost all semblance of organization. Individual knights and small groups continued to fight with desperate courage, but they could no longer coordinate their actions or support each other effectively. The wedge that had begun the day as a disciplined instrument of war had become a scattered collection of individual combats across several hundred meters of blood-stained ice. The moment when resistance collapsed is difficult to pinpoint precisely, but witnesses described a sudden shift in the battle's momentum. Perhaps it was the fall of a key commander, or the sight of the Livonian banner going down, or simply the cumulative effect of hours of combat under impossible conditions. Whatever the trigger, the remaining Livonian forces began to withdraw toward the western shore of the lake. This withdrawal quickly became a rout. Knights who had maintained their discipline throughout hours of combat found themselves part of a panicked flight across treacherous terrain. The ice that had complicated their attack now made their retreat a nightmare. Heavily armored men struggling to move quickly across slippery surfaces became easy targets for pursuing Russian forces. Horses that had been wounded during the battle collapsed under their riders, creating additional obstacles and casualties. Alexander's pursuit was methodical rather than frenzied. His forces maintained formation as they pressed their advantage, cutting down fleeing enemies while avoiding the disorganization that often accompanies victory. The discipline of the Russian pursuit ensured that few Livonian soldiers escaped the battlefield intact. Those who did reach the western shore carried word of a defeat so complete that it would reshape the political balance of the entire Baltic region. The aftermath revealed the true scale of the catastrophe that had befallen the Livonian expedition. Contemporary sources estimate that several hundred knights and their supporting troops died on the ice of Lake Peipus. For a military order that numbered perhaps 1,500 knights total, such losses represented an organizational disaster that would require years to overcome. The cream of the Livonian military leadership lay dead on the battlefield, along with the professional soldiers who formed the backbone of their territorial control. The battle's immediate consequences extended far beyond the tactical defeat. The fortress garrisons that depended on the mobile forces destroyed at Lake Peipus found themselves isolated and vulnerable. Local populations that had submitted to Livonian rule began to reconsider their allegiances. Trade routes that had been secured by military force became dangerous again. The entire structure of Livonian control in the eastern Baltic began to unravel. Within weeks, Livonian representatives approached Novgorod, seeking terms for peace. The negotiations that followed established boundaries that would remain stable for generations. The Livonian Order formally renounced all claims to Russian territory and agreed to pay compensation for the damage caused by their occupation. More significantly, they acknowledged that their expansion eastward had reached its permanent limit. The strategic implications of Alexander's victory resonated throughout northern Europe. Other German military orders observed that the systematic conquest of Slavic territories was not inevitable. Potential allies of the Livonian Order recognized that Russian resistance was more formidable than previously assumed. The balance of power in the Baltic region shifted decisively in favor of Novgorod and its allies. For Alexander personally, the victory at Lake Peipus established him as one of the foremost military commanders of his generation. His tactical innovations, particularly the use of flanking forces to envelop a cavalry charge, would be studied and copied by later generals. More importantly, his strategic insight in choosing the battlefield and timing the engagement demonstrated a level of military sophistication that placed him among the great captains of medieval warfare. The battle also demonstrated the crucial importance of understanding terrain and weather conditions in military planning. The frozen surface of Lake Peipus had appeared to offer ideal conditions for cavalry operations, but the reality proved far more complex. Ice that could support static weight became treacherous under the dynamic stresses of combat. Conditions that seemed neutral actually favored the more adaptable and lightly equipped Russian forces over their heavily armored opponents. The cultural and political ramifications of the Lake Peipus disaster extended far beyond the immediate military consequences, fundamentally altering the trajectory of medieval European expansion. The Livonian Order's defeat sent shockwaves through the broader Teutonic organization and their allies across the Holy Roman Empire. For decades, the systematic conquest of Baltic territories had seemed not just possible, but inevitable. German nobles had grown accustomed to viewing eastward expansion as a source of reliable territorial gains and religious validation. The destruction of an entire expedition on the frozen lake shattered these assumptions and forced a complete re-evaluation of expansion strategies. The immediate aftermath revealed the fragility of the entire Livonian administrative system. Fortress commanders who had governed conquered territories with confidence found themselves questioning whether relief forces would arrive if local populations revolted. Estonian and Latvian chieftains who had submitted to German rule began calculating whether the time had come to test their overlord's weakened position. Trade networks that had developed under Livonian protection became vulnerable to disruption as merchants reconsidered the risks of operating in disputed territories. Pope Gregory IX, who had explicitly endorsed the Teutonic campaigns against Orthodox Russian lands, faced the theological and political complexity of explaining why divine favor had apparently shifted to the schismatic enemy. The papal court had invested considerable prestige in the Northern Crusades, portraying them as essential to the broader project of Christian unity under Roman authority. Alexander's victory forced Vatican diplomats to reconsider whether military conquest was the most effective means of bringing Orthodox Christians under papal jurisdiction. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, already engaged in complex disputes with the Pope over imperial authority, observed the Livonian defeat with particular interest. The Teutonic Order served as both a military asset and a potential rival to imperial power in the Baltic region. Their weakening created opportunities for direct imperial intervention in Baltic politics, while also removing a useful tool for pressuring Polish and Danish neighbours. The emperor's response to the crisis would influence German-Baltic relations for generations. Within Novgorod itself, Alexander's triumph generated political consequences that extended well beyond military acclaim. The merchant oligarchy that effectively controlled the republic had initially been divided over the costs and risks of confronting the Livonian Order directly. Some had advocated accommodation or tribute payments rather than expensive military campaigns. Alexander's decisive victory vindicated those who had supported armed resistance, while marginalizing voices that had counseled compromise with Western expansion. The victory also strengthened Alexander's position in his complex relationship with the Mongol Empire. Batu Khan and the other Mongol commanders recognized military competence when they saw it. A Russian prince capable of destroying Western armies was valuable to Mongol interests, particularly as the Golden Horde consolidated control over Eastern European territories. Alexander's success against the Livonians demonstrated that he could serve Mongol strategic objectives while maintaining effective control over his own territories. The tactical lessons of Lake Peipus spread through military circles across Europe with remarkable speed. Professional soldiers and military theorists recognized that the battle had revealed fundamental weaknesses in conventional heavy cavalry doctrine when applied to difficult terrain and winter conditions. The idea that armored knights were invincible in open battle had already been challenged by infantry victories at Courtrai and other engagements, but Alexander's systematic exploitation of environmental factors provided new insights into combined arms warfare. Military engineers began studying the battle's implications for fortress design and siege warfare. If heavy cavalry could be neutralized by terrain selection, defensive positions needed to account for seasonal variations in battlefield conditions. Castle builders started incorporating features designed to channel attacking forces into areas where natural obstacles would limit cavalry effectiveness. The frozen lake had served as a natural trap. Artificial equivalents could be constructed through careful site selection and engineering. The battle's impact on military logistics became apparent as commanders across Europe reconsidered the challenges of winter campaigning. The Livonian expedition had possessed adequate supplies and equipment by contemporary standards, yet their forces had proven vulnerable to environmental factors that went beyond simple cold weather. Fighting in armor on ice created physiological stresses that no amount of preparation could entirely eliminate. Future winter campaigns would require different equipment, different tactics, and different expectations about what constituted acceptable casualties. Religious authorities throughout Orthodox Eastern Europe celebrated Alexander's victory as divine vindication of their resistance to Western ecclesiastical pressure. The Patriarch of Constantinople, already engaged in complex negotiations with papal representatives over potential church reunion, could point to Lake Peipus as evidence that God favored Orthodox independence. Local bishops and monastery leaders who had feared forced conversion under German rule gained confidence that their religious traditions would survive Western military pressure. The battle's immediate strategic consequences became apparent as Russian principalities began coordinating their responses to external threats more effectively. Alexander's victory demonstrated that Western military techniques were not inherently superior to Eastern European warfare methods, when conditions favored mobility and adaptation over heavy equipment and rigid formations. This lesson encouraged other Russian princes to resist both Western expansion and excessive Mongol demands with greater confidence. Trade relationships across the Baltic region shifted dramatically following the Livonian defeat. Novgorod's merchants, no longer threatened by German territorial expansion, could negotiate commercial agreements from a position of strength. The Hanseatic League, which had been expanding eastward with Livonian military support, found their commercial ambitions constrained by the new political reality. Russian furs, honey, and other products became more expensive as Novgorodian traders gained leverage in price negotiations. The defeat also triggered internal reforms within the Teutonic Order itself. Military commanders recognized that their traditional tactics required modification for operations in Eastern European conditions. New training regimens emphasized fighting in difficult terrain and adverse weather. Recruitment policies shifted to attract knights with experience in frontier warfare rather than those whose credentials derived primarily from Holy Land service or Western European campaigns. These organizational changes took years to implement and never fully restored the Order's pre-1242 confidence in eastward expansion. the psychological impact of losing an entire army to Russian forces created lingering doubts about the feasibility of conquering Orthodox territories. Future Teutonic campaigns would be more cautious, more limited in scope, and more dependent on local allies rather than direct German military superiority. The battle's influence on diplomatic relations extended throughout Northern Europe as various powers recalculated the balance between Catholic and Orthodox spheres of influence. Denmark, which had supported Livonian expansion as a means of extending Scandinavian influence in the Baltic, began exploring alternative strategies for regional dominance. Sweden, already checked by Alexander's earlier victory at the Neva, recognized that coordinated attacks on Russian territories were unlikely to succeed without addressing the tactical innovations that had proven so effective at Lake Peipus. Polish princes, caught between German expansion from the west and Russian resistance from the east, gained additional diplomatic leverage as both sides sought their support or neutrality. The complex web of alliances and rivalries that characterized medieval Eastern European politics shifted in ways that would influence regional conflicts for centuries. Alexander's victory had demonstrated that the systematic Germanization of Slavic territories was not inevitable, encouraging other Slavic leaders to resist Western pressure more actively. The long-term cultural impact of the battle extended far beyond its immediate political consequences. Lake Peipus became embedded in Russian historical consciousness as a defining moment when Orthodox civilization successfully resisted Western conquest. This cultural memory would be revived and reinterpreted during subsequent conflicts between Russia and Western European powers, providing a historical precedent for resistance that transcended the specific circumstances of medieval warfare. The battle also entered German historical memory, though with different implications. For German nationalists of later centuries, the defeat at Lake Peipus represented an early failure in the historical mission to bring civilization to Eastern Europe. This interpretation would influence German attitudes toward Eastern European peoples and contribute to ideologies that justified renewed expansion eastward. The medieval defeat became part of a larger narrative about German destiny that would have tragic consequences in the 20th century. Modern military historians recognize Lake Peipus as an early example of how environmental factors can decisively influence battle outcomes when commanders understand how to exploit natural advantages. The engagement demonstrated that tactical innovation and terrain selection could overcome significant disadvantages in equipment and training. Alexander's victory prefigured later conflicts, where mobility and adaptation proved more valuable than superior technology or conventional military doctrine. The archaeological record of the battle remains frustratingly incomplete, despite numerous attempts to locate physical evidence of the engagement. The lack of artifacts from Lake Peipus itself has led some scholars to question whether the battle occurred exactly as described in contemporary chronicles. However, the absence of archaeological evidence may simply reflect the difficulty of preserving materials in an aquatic environment over 8 centuries. What remains indisputable is the battle's immediate impact on the political and military situation in the Baltic region. The Livonian Order's expansion eastward ceased permanently following their defeat. The boundary established between Orthodox and Catholic spheres of influence proved remarkably stable, persisting with minor modifications into the modern era. These concrete results validate the essential accuracy of chronicle accounts, regardless of disputes over specific tactical details. The victory at Lake Peipus secured Alexander Nevsky's reputation as one of medieval Europe's most capable military commanders. His ability to analyze enemy strengths and weaknesses, select favorable battlefield conditions, and coordinate complex tactical maneuvers marked him as a strategic thinker of exceptional ability. The battle demonstrated that military genius could emerge from any cultural tradition, and that Western European military methods were not inherently superior to Eastern alternatives. More broadly, Lake Peipus illustrated the importance of understanding local conditions in military planning. Commanders who relied on tactics that had proven successful in familiar environments could face catastrophic defeat when those same methods were applied inappropriately. The frozen lake appeared to offer ideal conditions for cavalry operations, but the reality proved far more complex than surface appearances suggested. The battle's lessons about terrain, weather, and tactical adaptation would influence military thinking throughout the medieval period and beyond. Future commanders would study Alexander's methods and attempt to apply similar principles to their own strategic challenges. The victory demonstrated that careful preparation, thorough intelligence gathering, and tactical flexibility could overcome apparently insurmountable odds. As April 5, 1242 drew to a close, and the survivors of both armies struggled to comprehend what had occurred on the frozen surface of Lake Peipus, the full implications of the day's events remained unclear. What was immediately apparent was that the political and military balance of the Baltic region had shifted decisively. The age of unchallenged Western expansion into Orthodox territories had ended in blood and ice, establishing boundaries that would endure for centuries and creating precedents that would influence European conflicts far into the future. The survivors who limped away from Lake Peipus carried with them more than physical wounds and the memory of defeat. They bore witness to a fundamental shift in how medieval warfare would be understood and conducted in the harsh realities of northern European terrain. The frozen lake had served as both battlefield and teacher, demonstrating that environmental conditions could transform military advantages into fatal liabilities within the span of a few brutal hours. The immediate practical consequences became apparent as rescue efforts began in the days following the battle. Bodies scattered across the ice told a story that went beyond simple combat casualties. Many of the dead showed signs of exhaustion and exposure rather than battle wounds. Men who had survived the initial fighting had succumbed to the cold during attempted retreat, their heavy armor becoming a death trap rather than protection. Others had simply collapsed from fatigue, unable to maintain the energy required to move quickly across treacherous footing while wearing equipment designed for solid ground. The Battle of Lake Peipus stands as proof that understanding terrain matters more than superior equipment. Alexander Nevsky's victory wasn't won through legendary icebreaks or divine intervention, but through tactical intelligence that turned environmental challenges into weapons. The frozen lake that promised ideal cavalry ground became a trap for those who failed to adapt. This engagement permanently halted Teutonic expansion eastward, establishing boundaries between Orthodox and Catholic Europe that endured for centuries. The real lesson remains clear. In warfare, the commander who best understands his battlefield holds the decisive advantage.